Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Coach's Corner University podcast. I'm your host, Paul O'Neid, and as usual, we are brought to you by Coach's Corner University. You can save $300 off of our continuing education platform, the Education Collective, using code podcast300. That's only going to be valid for the next month. After that, I will be switching to a subscription model, but anyone who has access for lifetime now will retain access when we switch models. We're also sponsored by TC Nutrition, Barefoot Shoes, and Bacon and Barbells. You can find links to those in the description below. Today is a really cool episode for me. I get to speak to someone who I connected with, we just figured out was 15 years ago. Coach Joe Connolly, the head coach of sports performance at Arizona State University. We first met, I believe, at the CSCCA conference when you were working at the University of South Carolina, South Carolina State University.
No, University of South Carolina.
University of South Carolina. Sorry, I got it right.
USC East.
USC East, yeah, exactly. And funny story, I'm actually moving to South Carolina in 2 months. So there you go.
Nice.
Joe, thank you so much for joining me. The reason I was so excited is because you're actually a strength coach who fucking lifts weights hard. And we were just chatting a bit before the podcast about that and why you feel it's so important. So let's dive in. Has competing in strength sports always been something that's been part of your coaching practice?
Yeah, I mean, I've sort of had the chance to over the course of my career. I was a Division I athlete. I was a baseball player in college, and this was back in the day when everybody sort of trained the same. We trained like a football team, essentially.
Okay.
And oftentimes I was a lot better at the training part of things than I was at the actual sport. And I really enjoyed it. And, not to get too far ahead of the skis, but, I sort of had an epiphany one day that this is what I wanted to do. And all part of that, all along the way, I was able to compete in some form of the strength sports, right? I competed in Olympic weightlifting and during my master's program on an Olympic weightlifting team. When I got to, University of Louisville, I was sort of surrounded by, some coaches that were into strongman. So I said, you know what, let's do it. And I competed in strongman. And then shortly after that, when I got to South Carolina, and I was thinking about it at Louisville, but, I competed in USA powerlifting.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a great experience. And I did a Highland Games when I was at South Carolina, which was a blast with some of those guys from Sornex. And I've always kind of stayed close to the iron because I felt like everything that we do to train athletes comes from one of those applications. And really what our job is to kind of differentiate what philosophy we want to use at a given time to facilitate a physiological adaptation that we want. And that's always been something that I feel super, super passionate about. I still do a variation of what our athletes are doing even now. Oftentimes I look forward to the time when football shows up so I can kind of do my own training a little bit more because, if they're going down to 2 days a week, I'm sure not doing that. So I can, do a lot of different stuff during that time. Like in season, I usually sort of transition to something a little bit more powerlifting like at this point in time. But to me, that was training myself and educating myself and listening and learning from other coaches that are in the strength professions. Mm-hmm. And reading and absorbing all that stuff has always been something that's I'm super passionate about and it's helped me, in programming to this day.
Well, for me, it always came down to a level of empathy because at the end of the day, we're trying to force these athletes' bodies and minds into places that are uncomfortable for them. And so how are we supposed to do that, in my opinion, in an ethical way? until we've pushed our own bodies and minds to those places as well. And that's not to say that you need to be the best in the world at whatever you're doing, because obviously these kids want to be the best in the world at what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
But you should be aiming for some sort of personal progression, some sort of thing that's outside of your comfort zone. And not only that, I found my own experience under the bar just expedited my education, because you figure out really quick what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, I tend to agree. And you know, I've always sort of had that mindset of, what, however you want to call it. The cliche is, right, the discomfort, right, seeking discomfort. But to me, it's more the challenge, to just see if you can do it.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point in my lifting career, I'm not doing all the craziness from a load perspective that I was able to do 10 years ago. I'm still all right, but I've tried to find other outlets to get uncomfortable, whether it be experimenting with endurance sports and running and different things like that. Like every year I always try to find one thing that me personally that just like kind of gets me motivated
Okay.
to just do something crazy and figure out how to train for it and educate myself in it. And that's just something that I feel like helps me move forward as a human being more than anything else, as a husband, as a father, right? Like it allows me to be focused on a goal,
Yeah.
just from a personal perspective, you know?
Yeah. I always found too, like, through that self discovery, it does shape your philosophy on training to some degree. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
remember there's at one period, obviously, when you first start coaching, I think when we met, I was still an intern, or no, I was a GA at that point. But, you know, I had only this limited amount of experience, and that was powerlifting. So a lot of my programs looked like powerlifting.
Mm-hmm.
But then I, connected with Cam Davidson, a mutual friend of ours, learned more about Olympic weightlifting. So some Olympic weightlifting showed up my programs, and then started expanding my repertoire into bodybuilding and things like that. So, the scope of the training changed. And I remember at one point I started doing more conditioning work, and I was like, oh wow, like I've been ignoring the engine of my athletes for a really long period of time. So that reshaped the philosophies. And you only learn that through experimentation. And I'm actually really glad that you mentioned, pushing yourself as a person, as a husband, as a father, because I get approached a lot by young coaches who want to get into collegiate strength and conditioning because they know that I was there. They also know that I left. And obviously there are questions about why. Part of that had to do with the nomadic lifestyle associated with the college game. You've been at Harvard, you've been at SC, you've been at UMass, you've been at Louisville, you've been, now at ASU. Talk to me a little bit about the mentality that you have to have, and the support that you need to have from your partner during those transitions.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that I would be able to do what I do without my wife Shalana. She's the rock of the family. We were married for I think 11 years, before we had my daughter Callie, who's now 3.5,
Oh,
and my
wow.
son Cade, who's 1.5. Um,
Amazing.
and she also got drugged to two different cities around the country before we were even married. Um, I remember we were living together in Massachusetts when Joe Ken offered me a job, an opportunity at University of Louisville. And I remember going home and saying, "Sweetheart, I am taking a job at University of Louisville and I am leaving tomorrow. And I would love for you to come with me. But I am leaving tomorrow and that's that."
Mm-hmm.
And to her credit, she packed up the whole house and was out there within a month and a half and found a new job. She had a great job in Massachusetts and she found a new job. So the sacrifice,
Amazing.
um, I don't know if I'll ever be able to repay her for some of that sacrifice. And then, we lived together in Louisville for a year and the same thing happened. Um, Craig Fitzgerald got a job at South Carolina. he called me because he was, one of my mentors and best friends from Harvard. And I remember going home and saying, honey, I'm moving to South Carolina. I really want you to come with me, but I'm moving to South Carolina and I'm leaving tomorrow, and, and
What a saint.
yeah. And she turned it around again. And by the time we got to South Carolina, I was like, you know what? I think I got myself a good one. I got to put a ring on this one
Oh yeah.
and wrap this thing up. And, it's been obviously a long journey ever since. And then obviously now the last 3.5 years incorporating children into that scenario makes things a lot more difficult. And I think that required even more sacrifice from her.
Yeah.
And for me to work the hours that I work, for her to be the head coach of the household, and it's because she had a great career. I mean, she's an RD. She was
Oh
a
wow.
state champion power lifter in the 105 weight class. I mean, she had one of the highest Schwartz formulas in the history of USAPL. And so she was kind of a savage, and she was CSCS. She had all that. And um, since the birth of our children, a lot of that has been given up, So not only the profession, but the family life of that and how that looks. And, I think she's going to start making her way back into the workforce here pretty soon. But ultimately, a ton of sacrifice,
Yeah.
driving across the country when we were at UMass, when I got the job at Arizona State. I mean, it's
It's a
been a
long
wild
drive.
ride.
It's a long drive.
It was 42 hours. Yeah.
Yeah. That beats mine. I think our longest drive was 37.
That's still
We
pretty
did.
good.
Yeah. Well, last summer we moved from Ottawa to Houston. We spent the winter in Houston. It was 37 hours each way. Um, I have to ask, and this is a question that I actually forgot to ask both Coach House and Cam. Why do you do it? Why do you
I do,
coach at the college level?
to me, it's always about the the selflessness of the profession.
Mhm.
I think that any coach, and I really learned the definition of being selfish from my father. He was a selfless guy in a lot of different aspects. He was a mechanic. He was an aircraft mechanic, and I just remember him fixing everybody on our streets cars for free and helping them around the house for free. And just he was a guy that just liked to help people and didn't expect anything in return. And I think that I probably wasn't aware of that till like within the last couple of years. You get a little older and you start thinking about how you kind of came to the situation in life. And I try to always be that way with my athletes, to always be available, always be there to help. And ultimately in college, I think we make the biggest impact at one of the most important times in my instance now, a young man's life, but early in my career it was multiple sports. You can create and foster a foundation that these student athletes can lean on and use for the rest of their lives. I still talk to so many of my former student athletes that have gone on to do bigger and better things, and we love to reminisce about the old times, and they still talk about a lot of that stuff. And it makes me feel good that those instances and the impact that I was able to have on them, it's life lasting to me.
Yeah. And any strength coach that I talked to, even myself when I was working in the industry, it was you have to be willing to give more than you get back at any point in time. And especially when you're less established, you're not going to be making a lot of money. In fact, you're probably going to be poor. And you're also competing against people who are willing to work out of their car, like live out of their cars and travel wherever they need to go.
Mm-hmm.
But then you factor in a wife and a family. What has stopped you from pursuing something where arguably you could probably make more money much easier, have more freedom, and still coach, but you continue to work? And this isn't like a baited question at all. It's just, I think people really need to understand, and this is something that I try to do very well with the podcast, is people need to understand what is involved in different professions and what are the trade-offs that you're making and the motivations behind those trade-offs.
I mean, certainly now at this point, it would have to be something pretty remarkable to get me to uproot my family at this point in time. Now,
Mm-hmm.
obviously I went through a coaching change 2 years ago, and that was something where it was a really stressful time. I mean, I basically moved out of my office. We had photos of our home done. We were ready to put it on the market and ready to find the next place. And ultimately I got to move back into my office and, delete those photos and all that stuff. But um, it would have to be something pretty remarkable if it was a step up. But this profession is not guaranteed. So
Mm-hmm.
tomorrow we could be finding the next spot. Something could happen. I've been through it with, Steve Spurrier retiring week 4 of the 2015 season and Sean Elliott taking over as interim. And, in December of that year, Will Muschamp was hired and I was gone. And whether it had anything to do with what I did, in the weight room or not, who knows? But
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, he had a guy and
Mm-hmm.
I was gone. And to me, in reality, there's so many variables that need to be considered, and the discussion has to be had because it's a collective decision between you and your family if it's your decision. But if it's not your decision, everybody just needs to be aware that it is a possibility always. And that
Mm-hmm.
can be daunting for, I think, some people. Um, I try not to worry about the unknown and just sort of focus on the task at hand in regards to that. But I mean, just think about it. You have to pack your whole house. You have to get it listed. You have to purchase a new home. As a coach, you're usually expected to be there very quickly. So you got to go ahead of your family and live in a hotel for however long and work and communicate back home and then fly back home and then, pack up your house and make sure the movers are there. And then it's a wild ride.
Yeah.
I've been really fortunate though. I've spent 2 long stints at two places. So I was at South Carolina for 7 years, and this is season 8 here.
Right.
Um, so I feel really good about that. I think that's probably fairly atypical
Well, yeah.
in the world of Power Four, so to speak. But again, there's a lot of nuance to it, and there's a lot of variables. You know,
So you just put it out of your head. You're like, I can't control this. All I can control is these 4 walls and these kids that are in front of me. I'm going to put all my energy into that. Um, Maybe it's a bit outside the scope of a conversation, but I think, from a family planning, financial planning perspective, you must have something in the background, like a safety net, just in case.
yeah, we always have. My wife calls it our security fund. It's 6 months of living
Mm-hmm.
expenses, and that was saved up a long, long time ago, and it just stays there and it's ready to roll at a moment's notice. It's the emergency fund. We're fortunate enough to be able to do that,
Yep.
and she it makes her feel safe at the end of the day. Because if she doesn't feel safe, then it's not good.
It's not going to be a happy place for you.
No, mm-mm. I promise you that.
Talk to me a little bit about how the coaching industry has changed over the years, especially with the NIL coming into play. How has that affected life in the weight room?
Yeah, I'll say this. I've heard a lot of people talk about it. And I don't see a ton of change from my perspective. I
Okay.
think that if my coaching style was a little different and or, you know, listen, Arizona State is not Ohio State. It's not one of the programs with, you know, I'm not to say that we don't have NIL because we have a lot of it, but I would say it's fairly manageable. I know everybody talks about having to tiptoe around the athletes. I don't do that. I coach them. I tell them why, and I expect a lot out of them. And for me, not a damn thing's changed. And I don't know if that's everybody's experience, but that's my experience. We have great human beings on our roster. I think the accountability they have for each other. I think the work ethic they have. It's a testament to the football staff and Coach Dillingham and these coaches recruiting good human beings first that have loyalty and obviously they have the athleticism, but they have the loyalty, they have the knowledge, the smarts, they listen, they're good people. It's a and then the expectation and the standard that he sets on a daily basis, and I sort of back up in our world is it is ironclad. It doesn't change. So it allows, when something does happen, I don't even barely have to say anything. The athlete knows what the repercussion is, no matter what the
Mm-hmm.
thing that happens is, right? So it's a really good situation that way, and it wasn't always that way here. Um, I had to be the hammer and the enforcer and the police and everything you could think of. And then once the season hit, it was, oh, don't worry about it. So that that tends to fracture a culture really quickly.
Absolutely.
Um, and we don't have that now. And I think that has probably more to do with our success than anything else.
I love that. How has the advent and adoption of different sports science modalities changed your approach?
I think that if you don't adapt, you're dying, right? So for us, I am always a skeptic in
Me too.
regards to a lot of the new fandangled trends and technologies that are around. I have to use it. I have to trial it. I have to learn it, evaluate it at nauseum. I have to look at the data. I have to, I really have to dig into it, and then I have to figure out where the best place it fits within our system is. And I think that we have a really good variety of technologies now that we utilize. I mean, shoot, I remember in 2009, we had 20 catapults at South Carolina, and
In
you had to call us.
2009?
Oh yeah,
Oh,
and
wow.
you had to call Australia and talk to, and we were collecting data. We didn't know what to do with it. We didn't know anything. And their their software was crazy antiquated. It was real difficult to learn, and we had to learn all that. And it's I've used damn near every technology there is now at this point, and I've also had zero technology at University of Massachusetts at the time. So
Yep.
kind of run the gamut and figured out the best way to get the job done with a stopwatch or with a camera and a GPS unit and a Tendo unit and a elite form and a perch. And um, so I think just educating yourself on and communicating with other coaches and trying to decide how to use certain things, where they fit best within your program. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to have some, because the recruitable athletes that are walking in the room expect to see that. And
Yep.
to me, if I'm going to tell them that we have it and we use it, we actually use it. I'm not going to lie to them and say, oh, we just, track practice for shits and giggles. No, we track practice to manage players' workloads and to determine return to play protocols and to, look at high speed yardage and all the different things that we look for. And um, we actually use it to better the experience for the student athlete.
Yeah, I whenever I was in the industry, I remember my first like full head coach gig. They were like, "Yeah, you got to put in some sports science stuff," and I was like, "I don't want it." I was like I was super hard. I'm like, I don't want it. It's going to take away from the atmosphere of the gym.
Yeah.
I want kids to train. And I was, to be honest, now looking back, I was totally ignorant to how it could actually amplify the culture of the weight room
Yeah.
and improve buy-in. Um, but the way that it's being used now and how it's completely permeated the industry of college strength conditioning, like if you're not tracking, GPS data, if you're not tracking player loads, you're not tracking HRV, you're not tracking all these other things, you truly are going to miss the boat because there are so many ways in which you can optimize the implementation. Do you guys have someone on your staff who's like the sports science person, or is that you?
It's all so I like to keep it in-house, so to speak.
Okay.
So my first assistant, Clayton Curvin, has been with me. He was originally hired him at UMass, and he was subsequently the hockey strength coach at UMass for a few years when I first got here. And then I had an assistant leave here, and we brought him in. He's sort of taken the reins on a lot of that stuff, but he's he's literally in the same office I am. So
Okay.
it's a collective effort with everybody on staff.
Okay.
I like that better because you can share ideas. The lower guys on staff are learning and listening to what we're saying. I think that's a better learning environment, and I think it's a better collaborative environment than just to say you have a sports science guy that doesn't understand strength and conditioning and the nuances of it. He's
Yeah.
just good at data, and there has to be a really good melt. I think that's part of the reason why a lot of times the high performance model fails is that there isn't the right communication um, that needs to be had between your athletic training, your nutrition, your sports science, and your sports performance. And I feel like here we've created a really good team that allows that to kind of happen collectively. I just told a group of we had a elite recruiting day, right? And we had
Mhm.
30 or 40 athletes that we we invited to come to campus. And one of the things I told them when I was doing my 15 minutes was I said, if you're currently training with multiple people and those two or three people aren't communicating with each other, then you have a
Mhm.
major problem.
Absolutely.
And you just use that as an example for how we do things, where we communicate constantly about a given athlete, about a given training load, about what the volumes were for the day, the soreness levels, all the different nuances of, and then turn over every rock you can to help fix that. But
There has to be an element of ego that you have to set aside too, right? Because like if you're working with multiple people who are experts in their field, right? So your sports med, they're experts. You are the expert in the weight room. Then you have your sports science expert. You have your nutrition expert. You guys can't have any ego if you're trying to figure out what's best for the athlete.
yeah, I think we all have some form of ego, but
Well, yeah, for sure.
for me, I try to stay as far away from that as possible. I try to pretend like I know nothing and listen to them like they know everything, and then sort of figure out ways to, say, hey, tell me about this, or do you know anything about this particular method or modality or nutritional supplement or whatever. Oftentimes I have an idea of what I'm looking for, but I
Of
like to
course.
let everybody kind of present what sort of they think is best, whether
Hmm.
it's a hamstring rehab protocol or, you know, creatine or whatever it is, or a given technology, like to me it's I try to let everybody do their job. And
Hmm.
sometimes, I'll even say, hey, go ahead. if you think that's right, then let's do it. And maybe it works and maybe it doesn't, and I just think that letting your staff and letting the people that work under you do their job is extremely important, because it facilitates a better working life balance, and a better understanding of the nuances of the sport. My staff's the same way. My 5 guys are the same way. Like, we program together,
Okay.
and we start fresh every January and program all the way through July, and manipulate everything that's necessary, and change anything that needs to be changed, and come up with new ideas together collectively. And ultimately, I'm the one that's writing the program, so I have sort of final say on the nuances of it. But I want them to be engaged and excited about learning and developing as a coach. And they may not always agree with my final decision, but I will let them present what they think is better than what we currently do, right? And allow them to try to prove their point. I think that's important.
Where do you draw your line in the sand, though? Like, what are like the hills that you're going to die on, that we need to do this, or do you have them?
I don't necessarily have them. If there is a method or philosophy that is tried and true, proven to facilitate the physiological adaptation we want to elicit at a given time, then I am willing to listen and do it. But there's always a but. But, you better make sure. I mean, obviously, safety, all that stuff is first and foremost.
Of
But,
course, goes without
right.
saying.
And I think at this point, the majority of my staff has been with me long enough. They kind of know what the sort of basic structure is and how things sort of flow throughout the year. But if there is something that can help us become a better program, then we're doing it.
I love it. You alluded a little bit to fostering a learning environment for the younger coaches on your staff.
Mhm.
That is something that I definitely want to chat with you about, because you've been with multiple programs. I'm sure you've had probably close to 1,000 of interns, young coaches come through your programs at this point.
Yeah.
What are some things that you look for in a young coach as far as things that are assets to the programs that you're working with?
I think the biggest thing that for me is lacking when we get a intern or new young coach that's straight out of school is they might be really book smart, but they have very little experience coaching on the floor, and
Okay.
how to apply their book knowledge, their educational knowledge practically in the moment. And oftentimes, I think one thing, uh, I mean, I don't like to use myself as an example, but when I started, the only reason why I had any real good practical knowledge of technique work was because of my Olympic weightlifting background.
Fair. Yeah.
And that was one thing that I think Craig Fitzgerald was drawn towards, in that it was almost natural for me to walk through the weight room and say, no, you got to, here, move this here, do this here. And you do it at a rapid pace, you do it in the moment. But when you see an athlete that's been coached well somewhere, doesn't have to be Olympic weightlifting, doesn't have to be
Right.
powerlifting, could be sports, could be, a private sector coach that, had some good idea of what he was looking for. I think, and then expanding on that knowledge base and creating a bigger toolbox for that young coach, I think that's the most important thing. And being able to know your plan so well that you can deviate from your plan in the moment to something that may or may not be what you had planned, but is still going to get the goal accomplished at the end of the day. Now, that might take a while.
Of course.
We have probably 4 to 6 interns every semester, plus in the summer. Some stick around. I like when they stick around for a full year. because they get to see, they get to see January, they get to see early off season, they get to see spring ball, they get to see summer 1, summer 2, they get to see camp, they get to see in-season training. They get to see the developmental group. They get to see all those things and experience what a full calendar year, a full annual plan looks like. And a lot of times they think that they're just going to come in here and like, I'm coaching, and it's like, well, like I want you to learn everybody's name, right? I want you to know where everything goes, right? Like there's so many
Mm-hmm.
nuances to it, but at the end of the day, like, the practical application and the technical cueing and understanding the why of all that, to me, is like, that's, if you can figure that out, you're in the right spot.
I actually love that one of the things that you mentioned was learning the athletes' names, because it speaks to the soft skills involved in the coaching process. Because that echoes very heavily on like my personal journey. Because when I got to South Florida as an intern with Ron, and I was like, you know, I had read all the manuals. I was, a high level lifter. I was very strong. I'd never competed in anything before at that point, but I was still a lifter.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember stepping into Ron's office one day and I was like, Ron, like no one is listening to me. And he's like, what do you mean? I'm like, no one gives a shit what I have to say, even though I know what I'm talking about. And he looked at me, he goes, Paul, you're a white kid from Canada who never played college ball. Why would they listen to you? And I was like, okay. It's like, you need to compete in something so that they see that you have some credibility. And lo and behold, when I registered for a meet. I let all the guys on my platform know. I was like, yo, I'm going to compete in a powerlifting competition. They saw me training. Now they start listening and they start realizing, oh, Coach Paul knows, he's going to be lifting in a competition. He's putting himself through the ringer. And now I had some credibility, and now I learned how to relate to the athletes more. And that was kind of the door opening for me. And then was when I got to Robert Morris with Todd Hammer.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, the kids need to know you care. They need to know you're in it more than the X's and O's. Do you think that that's something that you because I had to learn it the hard way, but I learned it. I know very few coaches who've actually learned it and put it into practice, and they actually they can't get further in their career because they never actually learn how to coach the person. How do you teach that?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely know some coaches that don't understand the nuances. And, in reality, to go back to your question about NIL, I think that, in reality, if you have that relationship with your players, and it doesn't matter how much damn money they're making, they're still
Right.
going to listen to you. They're still going to do what you tell them because they know that you care about them. They know what you're talking about. And they've seen the improvements over the course of time, right? You have to show them those improvements in a lot of different ways and different metrics and all that stuff. But, if you can do that, then you got them no matter how much money they have, and we had an intern last year who's now at Idaho, and he's an assistant at Idaho. I don't know if he's going to New Mexico or not, but Idaho's head strength coach was an old intern for me when I was at South Carolina, Caleb. And he came in, and similar to your story, I remember the first week he came in hot as a tea kettle, right? Former wrestler, screaming and yelling at everybody. And I was like, yo, buddy, listen, his name was Seth. Seth, he's a good kid, and he's learned a ton. I'm like, Seth, just shut up and listen. Don't
Yeah.
say anything. He's like, how come they're not doing what I tell them? I'm like, they don't know who you are. They don't know your name. They don't know who you are. They know you're an intern. Like, just stand over there and write down the weight that they do. Like, don't even, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, don't do anything. And,
Yes.
and I'm like, let us do the coaching right now. I'm like, we'll get there, but don't be impatient about it. And
Yeah.
it was a similar conversation that, Ronnie had with you. Like, Seth, buddy, like, you can't just, what if you just walked into Target and started screaming at somebody, Like, would you think that they would respond in a positive way towards you? No, it's the same thing in here. This is their world. You're new in their world. Like,
Yep.
you got to get to know them, man. You got to, they go introduce yourself, right? Like, yeah, I introduced you in front of the whole group, but they all forgot your name already. You just happen to be standing at their rack today. Like, it's theirs. It's not yours, you know?
I love that. I actually remember. So I was in charge of the tight ends. That was my platform, and there was. I mean, you're at South Florida, so you're getting some like deep South guys.
Mm-hmm.
I
Good luck.
couldn't. I couldn't understand what they were saying,
Mm.
so I had to have one of the guys translate for me when they were talking.
It's happened to me too. I have I haven't spoken in a while, but the South Georgia dialect, the
Oh,
low country South Carolina, the glades, right? Like that's
mm-hmm.
a different language you have to speak.
Yep.
Um, and I learned it all too well when I was at South Carolina. Coming Louisville was a little different, right? They had that Louisville sort of Cincinnati sort
Mm-hmm.
of Midwest dialect, but all the guys are the same way. Like it's a different language. You gotta learn and understand.
When you were talking about the NIL and when you were talking about creating relationships, the one thing that actually came to mind was like, I feel like it might actually be easier now to create a relationship with a player like that because they know that you have no financial interest in them because you don't make more money because they're making money. Interesting.
I don't have it, and to be honest with you, I stay so far away from that. Like, if you had a gun to my head right now and said, who's making what, I have no idea, and I don't care. And to me, it still comes down to building the relationship, creating the connection, understanding the individual, what makes them tick, what motivates them, what their triggers are, how to get to them. All those things are first and foremost, and then always explaining the why first. This is
Well,
why we're doing this, guys. This
well,
is why. And you might not like it, but this is why.
and if we return back to the beginning of our conversation, when I asked you, like, why are you doing this? You mentioned the impact that you can have on these players. And the only way that you can have that impact is to form those relationships. So it's a cyclical pattern in that
Mm-hmm.
the stronger you form that relationship, the more of an impact that you can have on them and the more buy-in that they're going to have and the more they're going to put effort and the better. So it all just feeds into itself, but it's value driven, right?
Mm-hmm.
So your values as a man and as a coach are what going to feed your ability to create that impact, which I love. Um, who have been the mentors for you that have had the biggest impact?
Yeah. So in my master's program in strength and conditioning, well, let me go back even further than that. My strength coach in college, Emil Johnson. I went to University of Hartford in undergrad. It was Division I baseball. Um, he was my first experience with real strength and conditioning. Yeah, I trained in high school, but I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And um, after that, Dr. Ellen Robinson was my basically advisor at Bridgewater State University. She was a savage. She was a world class Olympic weightlifter. She ran marathons. She was a power lifter. She was a bodybuilder. She did it
Wow.
all in like the 70s and 80s and 90s. And even up until the 2000s, she was still lifting in the Pan Am Games and competing in the Masters division and
That's
just
so cool.
absolute savage. And she was our Olympic weightlifting coach. Then obviously Craig Fitzgerald. We're as close as I think two strength coaches can be in this world. He's one of my best friends and mentors. He was the first guy that hired me at Harvard and hired me at South Carolina, and um, subsequently helped me sort of keep that job and become the director at South Carolina when he went to Penn State. Um, and then Joe Ken, he's a great mentor of mine. I only spent about 11 months with him at Louisville, but man, you want to talk about programming, exercise science, practical application 101. Like, I was a sponge for 11
Mm-hmm.
months. I mean, I lived in the players lounge when I first got there, and I would just sit and listen to him and Brian Dermody and Adam Fight and those guys and just listen to everything they said and just do everything I possibly could to learn and educate myself. And it's terrific. That year of my life was monumental in my growth, sort of as a strength coach. Curtis Fry, the track coach at South Carolina, really good mentor of mine. You know, I coached those guys when I was there. Even when I was a director, I was still coaching track and field for a little while there. And it's
Oh, you don't see that often.
learning the field. Yeah, no, you don't. And it was a funky deal, but I mean, it was
Funky deal.
it was fun. You know, we were working a lot. That's for damn sure. But
Yeah.
listening to him and some of his philosophies on speed and you know all the different events in track and field um, and obviously all the head coaches I've worked for have been awesome. Really have.
Take me through a day for you right now. Like, what does a day look like as a head strength coach for football at a big school?
We have a fantastic schedule. So the way ASU does it is from basically, we don't really typically we don't start at 6. We have the option to, but usually we start around 7. I train first thing in the morning because I don't have time. I know it's not optimal, but I don't have time to train once I get rolling. So, I usually get up around 3:45.
Classic. Yep.
Yeah, I get up early, 3:45. I, get my sups and my pot of coffee. I'm out the door and I get in the weight room and start training. I usually got about an hour and 15 minutes to train. Then I meet with my staff, go over the day, usually jump in the shower real quick, try to grab a bite to eat if I got time, and then start the training groups. Football is basically from 6 a.m. till 1 o'clock, and there are no academic conflicts. So none of our athletes have class in the morning, 0. So it's phenomenal in that at 1 o'clock they can turn their hat around and put on their academic hat, or they can stay. If they don't have class, they can stay and do more and film and all that stuff. But it's really, really amazing. I've never been anywhere that has that fine line of half the day is academics and half of it is training / football. Usually wrap up the last group around noon. I start my pro guy group at noon. So any of our rising seniors that are training for pro day, I always train those guys, especially this time of year. I'll train them for about 2 hours till about 2 o'clock, meet with the staff, go over the day, enter any data, put the finishing touches on all the data collection and the team competitions and all the different things we're doing, send all that data to the coaching staff, make sure everybody's, all their questions are answered. And right now in the off season, I can usually get out of here 4:30, which is to me like unbelievable because I can potentially go pick up my daughter at school and be home by dinner time at 5 and spend some time with my family and put the kids to bed and then hang out for a minute with my wife till my biological clock turns off and it's time for me to go to sleep again.
I love that. That schedule sounds actually awesome.
It's really good. I don't mind it. Yeah, I got to get up early, but it takes what it takes,
Now let's contrast that with what your schedule used to be. Because I will tell people when they ask me what my schedule was as a strength coach, so especially up here in Canada, when I was a head strength coach at Queens, my day would start in the weight room at 5, and then my day would end in the weight room at 10 p.m. And no one believes me. So tell me about what your schedule used to be, Coach.
Yeah, so let's go back. I'll give you a couple variations, right?
Okay.
So first variation was when I was still a graduate student at Bridgewater State and an intern at Harvard. I would depending on the day, I would get up at 2. I would drive an hour and a half to Harvard. I would train usually early in the morning. We had 42 varsity sports, and we
Yep.
had 3 full-time strength coaches and 3 interns. So interns were the head strength coach for some of the sports.
Okay.
I would train. Football started at 6, so train early, shower, meet with the staff with Fitz and Tim Mullen and Dan Perlmutter and the rest of the interns. Football started at 6. From 6 to 8 was football. 8:01, name your sport, right? Right in. There was, we were really fortunate. We had a big weight room.
Yeah, Harvard's
So
weight room is massive, isn't it?
yeah, Palmer-Dixon it was an old tennis facility. It's amazing. Now there's very little heat or air conditioning. So Boston winters tend to be a little chilly and Boston summers tend to be a little humid. So you were in the elements, but every single one of those 42 sports trained in our facility. So there was times where we would have 4 sports going at the same time, and you'd have a lead for each one of those 4 sports. And then whoever didn't have a primary sport was helping out as, your first assistant. So you would roll. At the time I was just an intern. So I would train teams till about 2:30, 3:00. And then I would get in my car, drive an hour and a half back to where I lived. And then I would start my bartending shift at 5. I would bartend till 11 or 12. I would go to sleep for 2 hours and then I would do it again. And
Yep.
that's what I did for a year and a half to survive. I barely had enough money to get to Boston at the time because gas was way high and it was brutal. Switch gears to South Carolina when we had essentially in our facility, we had football, we had swimming and diving, we had track and field, and we had men's soccer. And my first year as director at South Carolina, I had track and field. We're sort of transitioning track and field to one of my assistants. But I remember that first, couple months, we would train football. We had, I think, 3 football groups. If I remember correctly, we had the 6, the 9:15, and like the 12:30 group. So you would train those groups, set up, reset, train those groups. And those are each 2-hour sessions. So that's 6 hours. You had time at like 1:00 from like 1 to 3 to train and do any admin stuff, meetings, all that stuff. And then at like 3:30, 4:00, track and field practice would end. You'd have, those guys trickle in because God knows they never came when they were supposed to. And, we train those guys. There was 100 track athletes on South
track
Carolina.
teams are huge.
They're massive. And so we would train all them till 7:30, 8:00, something like that, give or take. And then, wrap up that day, data, numbers, any logistical stuff. Try to get a head start on the next day if you could. So, you're looking at 8:00, 9:00, 10:00 at night. Yeah.
And you do it because you love it. And you do it because when you're in it, it's fucking fun until you take a step back and you're like, whoa, I have no life at all.
I worked 16 hours yesterday and it felt like I worked 2,
Yeah. And it's, you truly, strength and conditioning at the college level for me is truly, it's a passion. You have to have a passion for what you do or else you'll simply burn out.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a lot of people like myself, I'm super passionate about strength and conditioning, but like, I just couldn't do it. I could not do the hours. And, the situation that I was in coming home to Canada, had I stayed in the US, I think I would still be a strength coach. But my family, my brother had his first 2 kids and I wanted to be home and closer to family. So I made that decision. And There's a huge part of me that, especially interviewing you, interviewing House, interviewing Cam, I'm like, man, I really miss college. I miss it every day. I miss being in the gym with those guys and girls, and that age category is just really special.
Yeah, you have a chance to make a difference, to make a mark, to even if it's just one little thing, that
Mm-hmm.
you work on and you work on and you work on for 6 months, and then they get it, that moment that they get it, it's worth all the reps and all the effort and all the talking and all the coaching that you put in, to that moment. One of my favorite things is when, it's one of my favorite things and one of my least favorite things at the same time. It's when an athlete that you coached for 4 years, you were on all the time about, pick your, the nutrition or the hydration or the training or whatever. And they go on to be, whatever it is they're doing, whether it's in professional sports or in the corporate world or whatever. And they call you in 2 years or 3 years or 5 years after they're done. And they say, you know what, coach, you were right. All those years, you
Mm-hmm.
were right about that consistency thing you always used to talk about, or, that nutrition thing you always used to talk about, or that technique you always used to talk about. And I understand what you're saying now. And it takes some people a little longer for some stuff to sink in. And it takes, you know, some people not a long time for it to sink in, but it always sinks in eventually.
I feel like I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Does that level of fulfillment that you feel in your job differ whether you're coaching a kid who is just going to go into the corporate world and live their life versus a young person who's going to go play in the NFL and be a star, first round draft pick?
No, not at
Yeah,
all. It's the same. It's the
yeah,
same thing. What's more important? It's
yeah.
not. It's not more important. That it's one track versus another track. It's the same. To me, it's the same level of importance.
I love that. Um, I got a couple of quick hit questions for you as we time it out. Just make sure that we're sensitive to your time. First one is, what's been the most valuable lesson you have personally ever learned under a barbell?
All right, I'm going to give you one of my most recent sort of quests. Um, so, strength and power has always been something that has come relatively easy for me. I think I have a certain genetic propensity for that. My mom was a sprinter. She was a basketball player. I sort of have some of her makeup and some of her genetics. She was always a really good athlete. Um, and I distinctly remember being like a freshman in high school, me and my buddies is like wandering around, finding our way into a weight room and like being like, all right, let's lift. Like, oh, we saw this. And I remember squatting like 315, like the first time I ever squatted, because we just kept putting weight on the bar and squatting. And so like I've always sort of had, and not to say that I'm the strongest guy in the world, because God knows I'm not, but I've always sort of had that genetic propensity.
Mm-hmm.
So during COVID, and everybody's kind of got their own stories with this particular individual, but I read obviously David Goggins' book,
Mm-hmm.
Can't Hurt Me, and I was sort of at a point in time, I was about to turn 40, and I'm like, man, like, are my days numbered in this athletic endeavor that I've sort of chosen to do? And I was like, I got to figure out something to push myself, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I started running, and sidebar to that, I had patella tendonitis for like 12 years. It went away. Interestingly enough, I had all sorts of like hot spots all over me, and I'm still training at this point, but it
Yeah, of
went
course.
away, which was interesting. So, long story short, I'm on YouTube, and I saw this guy that in the same day he ran a 5-minute mile, he ran a marathon, and he squatted 500. same day. And I'm like, well, shit, I can't run a 5-minute mile, but I can damn sure squat 500 and run a marathon. So for my 40th birthday, present to myself, it was Easter Sunday on my 40th birthday. I trained for 16 weeks. I squatted 500. I changed my shoes and I ran a marathon. And I ran it
Jesus.
in 5 hours and 20 minutes. Um, and that was way, way, way outside my comfort zone for what I sort of genetically had, and also too like what my experience level was. I didn't have experience in really endurance sports at all, so I had to engross myself in books and novels about training for a marathon, and try to figure out, you know, how to incorporate the nuances and maintain the strength while you're pushing up the miles in the cardio. And listen, I know it was probably the dumbest thing in the world orthopedically for me to do at 240 pounds, but um, I just wanted to try something that was crazy and that was a
I love that.
challenge.
I
And
fucking love that.
it was like one of the, it's, my assistant tells the story. He came in the next morning, and like our weight room, the entrance to our weight room, he said there was a hat, like a shirt, like just like strewn about on the way. There's a hat, there's a shirt, there's a pair of shorts, there's socks, there's shoes. And I remember my wife texted me. So I was by myself.
Of course you were.
I was by myself,
Of course.
and it was 96 degrees that day.
Oh my God.
And the first 21 miles were like, I felt awesome. I had my electrolytes, I had everything. And like mile 21 and a half, I ran out. And the last 5 miles was a getter. Like I almost stopped. Like I wouldn't stop, but I almost stopped.
Right.
So I got in after I finished, 26.2, and I was wrecked, absolutely wrecked. And I remember I called my wife and I was like, I can't really walk. I was like, I can walk a little bit, but you got to come pick me up. And so she came, she drove the car up to the front of the building. She helps me up. She gets me in the car. I jump in the cold. Like I was
Yeah,
wrecked.
yeah, yeah.
But, Clayton came in the next day and he's like, I thought I was going to see a dead body in the office because it was all your clothes on the way to the office. And that to me, not necessarily under a barbell, but for me, that took me so far outside my comfort zone that um, I learned a lot about myself
Yeah.
during that. I think, and still to this day, I'll do some long trail runs in the desert and stuff on the weekends. And I really like unplugging and just going. And um, you do some of your best thinking, and you also can push past limits you thought maybe you had, but you don't.
And that's why I was so excited to chat with you, because that mentality of just pushing yourself to be uncomfortable. And you have you have every excuse in the world to not train as hard as you do, right? You have a family, you have a very demanding career. You're a servant for all intents and purposes to the folks that are in your life, but you never stop putting in credits to your own bank account first. And I think that deserves recognition. I think it's fucking awesome.
Well, I appreciate
Um,
it.
if you had a billboard on the side of a highway that everyone could read, what would it say on it?
It would be a blank billboard because I don't really want any attention. But if it was about something else, it would be, let's see, probably control your inner dialogue. And that would obviously mean, that would need a adjunct part of that. But most people have, sort of a couple voices that they don't even really know are talking to them inside their head. And some people have more than two, but most people have two. And one of them is usually one that looks for comfort and warmth and full and, you know, convenience. And the other one is a little bit more direct. And most people don't listen to the one that I think most people one of them might even like be asleep and go away. The one that it's sort of a motherfucker and says, you
Mm-hmm.
know, I need to do this. Like I was built to do these things, whatever it is. And whether it's some form of physical challenge, or it's, you know, take the fucking trash out, or do the dishes, or wash the car when it needs to be washed, or, you know, do the thing that you know is the right thing to do in the moment. Do
Mm-hmm.
it, and don't question it, right? Don't I'm tired, my knee hurts, I'm, you know, I didn't sleep enough last night, like fuck that. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you should do the thing that's right regardless of how you feel, because ultimately you're going to feel better if you do.
I think the true mark of someone who's mastered their inner dialogue is when those two voices become one, because that voice that is, you know, seeking comfort and, you know, happiness, and for like, you know, it tends to be more like hedonic for a lot of people,
Mhm.
but that motherfucker wants you to be better, and that other one wants you to be happy. But if being better makes you happy and they become one, now you've really unlocked a cheat code for life. So I love that billboard message.
That was a
Uh,
hell of a lot better of a description than mine. I like that, Paul.
I spend all day talking on calls like this. So my biggest, you know, my biggest asset as a podcaster, as a mentor, is just like, I take your words and I just flip them around a little bit. The last question I have for you is, if there was one person that you think I should interview on the podcast, who would it be? But the caveat is that you have to help me get them on.
Have you interviewed Craig Fitzgerald?
I haven't. To be fair, that guy scares the shit out of me.
You shouldn't.
Okay.
You shouldn't.
I
Now,
met him. I met him when he first got to Penn State, because when he first got to Penn State, I was visiting Cam.
yeah,
So he was like full of piss and vinegar when he was in there.
he's like that all the time.
Oh, perfect.
No, I mean, listen, he might yell at you, right? But like at the end of the day, it's all in love.
Of course, yeah.
I remember, so backtrack to when I was an intern.
Yeah.
And this is sort of when I think I earned his respect, is, you know, I would get up so early. He knew my schedule. And so I would get there. And I swear to God, every day when I got there, he would always be on his last set of squats. There's some form of heavy metal blaring in the weight room, and there's not a soul there. He's by himself. And he'll tell you, you know, he was pretty strong back in the day, but this was like when he was still kind of hanging on to it. So he would be going to fucking war with himself in the weight room, screaming every rep. And I would walk in and I would run over and help him, like just motivate him, spot him,
Yeah.
whatever. And it was like the greatest thing in the world. I'm like, this guy is fucking insane.
I love that.
And I love it. I love everything about it. I remember he missed a lift one time and he shattered his windshield on his old Ford Explorer. Like, and listen, mind you, he is lifting
My
for
guy.
nothing.
My guy.
He's lifting for nothing at this time. Like he just was lifting, you know,
Yeah.
to try to still be in good shape. He was probably, I don't know, 35 or something at the time. And he was so mad that he didn't get the lift. He shattered his windshield. I have so many Fitz stories, man. Like I remember one time we spent 4 hours in a meeting going over something like so small and so trivial, but it was important to him, that he got so frustrated. We had spent 4 hours on something. He deleted the file and started over. Like he literally was like, nope, delete the file, start it over. I was standing outside his office one time. He wasn't great at computers. I saw the monitor fly out. I saw the keyboard fly out. I saw the PCU fly out onto the weight room floor and shatter. I was like, fuck this computer. Like, we're going pen and paper today. Like, I mean, just like, it was just every day was something else.
I really have to interview this guy.
He's
I'm gonna hit you up for that. Joe, thank you so much for sharing your time with me, especially during such a busy time of the year. Um, I can't thank you enough. This is really insightful, and I think the audience is really going to enjoy it.
No, I appreciate it, Paul. Thanks for having me on. And I'll be honest with you, bro. I would have had this discussion with you if it wasn't a podcast. I don't really care. I like to kind of help. I like to have conversations. I like to talk. I like to, get to know new people and communicate with everybody, because quite honestly, I learned something during this. That's the biggest thing. So appreciate you.
I'm grateful. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. And Coach Joe, please make sure to like, share, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and we'll catch you on the next one.